On March 17, 1982, the secrets of a harsh winter in the Missouri Ozark Hills began to be revealed at Springs Dell. Margaret Wilson, an assistant social worker, visited an isolated cabin in Shannon County. What she discovered there would forever change her understanding of the limits of social isolation and the consequences of institutional neglect within America's rural communities. The Shelton property sat 27 kilometers from the nearest city, Current River. It was accessible only by a dirt road that turned impassable during the spring rains. For over 3 decades, the family had lived with virtually no contact with the exterior world. An anonymous complaint received by the Missouri Department of Social Services, claiming children were living in unhealthy conditions and possibly suffering abuse, was what motivated Margaret's visit. At the property, Margaret was received by Elijah Shelton, 47, a man of medium stature with a gray beard and intense blue eyes that seemed to carry the weight of generations of isolation. Living in the cabin with Elijah were his sister, Martha Shelton, 43, and 3 children: Thomas, 12, Suddy, 9, and little Jacob, just 5 years old. The cabin was a wooden structure built by Elijah's grandfather in the 1920s, containing 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room. A small barn, a vegetable garden, and a well were included on the property. There was no piped water or electricity. Their isolation was nearly total, with only occasional trips to the city for supplies they could not produce themselves. The climate that day was mild, with a temperature of 17 degrees and a partially cloudy sky. The recent defrost had left the ground around the cabin muddy, and the air carried the characteristic smell of wetland and decaying wood. Signs of mild malnutrition and a lack of basic medical care were noticed by Margaret in the children during her initial inspection. A badly healed scar on his right arm, the result of an axe accident the previous year, was on Thomas. Suddy had a mild strabismus that had never been treated. For his age, Jacob, the youngest, showed signs of cognitive developmental delay. However, what caught Margaret's attention were the physical similarities shared between the children and the 2 adults. They all shared striking features: the same intense blue eyes, the same facial bone structure, the same ear shape characteristics that suggested not just kinship, but a very close consanguinity. When asked about the children's mother, Elijah hesitated for a moment before answering that his wife had died during Jacob's birth. Martha remained silent, avoiding eye contact with the social worker. It was at this moment that Margaret began to suspect the story made no sense. No wedding certificate for Elijah Shelton was found in county records. In fact, the only documents found were the birth certificates of Elijah and Martha, children of Harold and Edith Shelton, and a land ownership record dated from 1924. The children had no official birth certificates. After the death of Elijah and Martha's parents in a fire in 1973, the Shelton family had gradually become isolated. Since then, the siblings had cut almost all ties with the local community, visiting the city for basic needs only. Residents of Current River described Elijah as a reserved, suspicious man who avoided prolonged interactions. The first suspicions that Martha could be the biological mother of the children began to form in Margaret's mind as she observed the family dynamics. The way Jacob clung to Martha's skirts, how she intuitively knew the needs of each child, and how her gaze revealed a deep maternal bond that went beyond that of an aunt. If you want to follow more cases like this, ones that shake society as a whole and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. The formal investigation into the Shelton case began on March 24, 1982, 1 week after Margaret Wilson's initial visit. A team was sent by the Missouri Department of Social Services in conjunction with the Shannon County Sheriff to evaluate the situation. The team consisted of Margaret, Police Officer David Tanner, and Dr. Robert Hayes, a pediatrician. The first obstacle the team encountered was Elijah's resistance. When confronted with more direct questions about the children's origin, he became defensive, claiming the authorities had no right to interfere with his family's life. "We take care of our own," he repeated, a phrase that would later reveal itself to be loaded with disturbing meaning. Martha, in turn, remained silent, responding only with monosyllables when questioned directly. The scene settings demonstrated a mix of curiosity and fear in relation to the visitors, revealing their limited contact with people outside the family core. Basic physical examinations were performed on the children by Dr. Hayes, who observed several worrying signs. Besides mild malnutrition and a lack of preventive medical care, he observed physical characteristics that could indicate genetic problems consistent with endogamy. Thomas had polydactyly, an extra finger on his left hand. Suddy had dental development problems, and Jacob showed signs of cognitive impairment more severe than initially perceived. These signs, when observed in isolation, can have several causes, Dr. Hayes explained in his report. But when observed together, added to the shared physical characteristics and family isolation, they raise serious concerns about possible consanguinity. A more accurate course was taken by the investigation when the team obtained access to the family's few medical records. In 1970, Martha had been treated in a hospital in a neighboring county after a domestic accident. The doctor had observed that she was 3 months pregnant. However, there was no record of any birth or adoption from that period. A deeper search of the records revealed a pattern. Martha had been treated at different regional hospitals in 1970, 1973, and 1977, years that would correspond approximately to the ages of Thomas, Suddy, and Jacob. On each occasion, she had used different names, but basic physical descriptions and medical data indicated it was the same person. A significant obstacle was encountered by the investigation when Elijah, sensing the direction of events, prevented investigators from entering the property. Legally, without concrete evidence of severe abuse or neglect, the authorities had limited options for intervention. It was at this moment that a crucial witness emerged. Sarah Jenkins, an 83-year-old woman who lived about 5 kilometers from the Shelton property, contacted Margaret after hearing rumors about the investigation. Sarah revealed that she had been a friend of Edith, Elijah, and Martha's mother, and that she had maintained sporadic contact with the family even after their isolation. Edith was always afraid something like this would happen, Sarah said. Harold kept the family isolated, saying the world was corrupt and that they could only trust their own blood. When they died in that fire, I tried to help the boys, but Elijah was already too much like his father, suspicious, hostile. Sarah revealed that she had visited the cabin a few times after the parents' death, carrying supplies and offering assistance. On one of these visits in 1971, she noticed that Martha was visibly pregnant. When she questioned him about it, Elijah expelled her from the property and forbade her from returning. I should have done something at that time, lamented Sarah. But who would have believed me? And where would those children have ended up? The system doesn't take good care of our own here. An important context was provided by Sarah's testimony, but it wasn't definitive proof. The investigation needed concrete evidence to intervene. A turnaround occurred when one of the agents, revising the birth records of Elijah and Martha, discovered something intriguing. Their parents, Harold and Edith Shelton, shared the same surname before marriage. Subsequent investigations revealed they were first cousins. In isolated communities like this, it is not uncommon, explained a local historian consulted by the team. In the early decades of the 20th century, many families in mountainous regions lived so isolated that marriages between close relatives ended up happening due to a lack of options. In some cases, this became almost a family tradition, justified by beliefs about blood purity. This discovery shed new light on the case. It wasn't just a possible incestuous relationship between Elijah and Martha, but potentially a pattern of generational endogamy that had intensified throughout the generations. A new theory was developed by the team. Elijah and Martha's parents, already cousins, transmitted isolationist beliefs to their children. After the parents' death, the siblings, already socially isolated and possibly influenced by distorted ideas about family and purity, established an incestuous relationship that resulted in the birth of 3 children. The investigation briefly found an obstacle when a local resident claimed to have seen a different woman on the Shelton property in the early 1970s. This information briefly reinforced the theory that a third person could be involved, perhaps a wife of Elijah who later disappeared. However, subsequent investigations revealed that the witness had probably confused the property or the date. Sheriff John Pearson, in relation to the allegations, began to consider obtaining a court order to collect DNA samples from the children and the adults. However, the legal process would be complicated, especially considering the family's isolation and the lack of conclusive evidence of abuse or neglect that would justify such an invasive intervention. We have to act carefully here, argued the sheriff. These people have lived this way for generations. For them, this is their normal way of life. If we invade the property without concrete evidence, we could lose any chance of helping these children. An impasse was reached by the investigation, one that would last for several months. During that period, the Department of Social Services maintained regular visits to the property, monitoring the children's well-being and gradually trying to build a relationship of trust with the family. The real turnaround in the Shelton case occurred in September 1982, 6 months after the investigation began. During one of her routine visits to the property, Margaret Wilson noticed that Jacob, the youngest, had a high fever and showed signs of a severe respiratory infection. Despite Elijah's initial resistance, she managed to convince him to allow the child to be taken to the hospital in West Plains, the next largest city. At the hospital, Dr. Michael Brennan, a genetic specialist consulted on the case, took the opportunity to perform more in-depth exams with the reluctant consent of Elijah, who accompanied his son. The results of Jacob's exams revealed multiple subtle congenital anomalies that individually could have gone unnoticed, but together formed a pattern consistent with a high degree of consanguinity. The genetic markers we are observing here, Dr. Brennan told the research team, are typical of children born from relationships between first-degree siblings. There is excessive homozygosity for even a relationship between first-degree cousins. During the 2 weeks of Jacob's hospitalization due to pneumonia complications, Martha remained constantly by his side, demonstrating striking maternal care and anxiety. It was during this period that Martha, physically and emotionally exhausted, finally began to open up to Margaret. One night, while Jacob slept under the influence of medication, Martha shared fragments of her story. She talked about the growing isolation after their parents' death, how Elijah gradually assumed the role of family patriarch, and how the boundaries between family roles became confused. "We didn't know anyone," Martha confessed in an almost inaudible whisper. "Elijah said the outside world wanted to separate us, to hurt us. We could only trust each other." Although Martha did not explicitly admit to being the children's biological mother in this conversation, her words and emotions made the situation increasingly clear to Margaret. The social worker, taking extreme care not to break the fragile trust being established, avoided asking direct questions about paternity, focusing on offering emotional support. Meanwhile, the documentary investigation continued. A significant advance occurred when researchers located a traveling pastor, Reverend Samuel Miller, who had visited isolated communities in the Ozark Hills during the 1960s and 1970s. Reverend Miller kept detailed diaries of his visits, including observations on the families he encountered. In an entry dated June 1969, he described a visit to the Shelton property. "I visited the Shelton family today. Their parents recently died in tragic circumstances, leaving 2 adult children, Elijah, 34, and Martha, 30. I found them living in extreme poverty and isolation. I offered spiritual and material assistance, but was received with suspicion, especially by the young Elijah. Something in the dynamics between the siblings seemed disturbing to me. Martha looked submissive, almost fearful. I fear that without the moderating influence of their parents, isolationist as they were, the situation may deteriorate. I intend to return, but I confess I felt powerless." A later entry from April 1971 was even more revealing. "I returned to the Shelton property after almost 2 years. I was prevented from entering by Elijah, who seemed even more hostile and paranoid. From a distance, I could see Martha briefly. She appeared to be in an advanced state of pregnancy. When I mentioned this to Elijah, suggesting they might need medical attention, he was furious, accusing me of spreading lies and threatening to assault me if I did not leave immediately. I reported my concerns to the local sheriff, but they said without concrete evidence of abuse, nothing could be done. These mountains keep their secrets, and I fear some of them are too dark to bear the light of day." Reverend Miller's diary provided the first contemporary evidence of Martha's pregnancy, corroborating the investigation's suspicions. Another crucial event occurred when authorities managed to locate medical records from a Springfield hospital where Martha had been treated in 1977 under the name Mary Smith. The records confirmed she had been hospitalized in advanced labor and had given birth to a boy with multiple health complications, including breathing problems and a slight cardiac defect. The birth date coincided with Jacob's approximate age. The medical team at the time noted concerns about possible genetic abnormalities and suggested further tests, but Mary Smith left the hospital against medical advice as soon as her condition and the baby stabilized. While Jacob recovered in the hospital, Dr. Brennan, with limited judicial authorization, performed additional examinations that revealed the boy had a rare genetic condition called Apert syndrome, characterized by malformations of the skull, face, hands, and feet. This syndrome can occur spontaneously, but its incidence increases significantly in cases of close consanguinity. Based on the new evidence, Judge Eleanor Simmons issued a warrant authorizing DNA tests on all Shelton children and adults. The results, obtained in November 1982, were conclusive. Elijah was the biological father and Martha the biological mother of all 3 children. Leave a comment. Never give up on the truth if you believe all cases of family abuse deserve to be investigated, no matter how isolated the community. On December 7, 1982, based on genetic evidence and collected testimonies, Elijah Shelton was formally accused of incest, a Class D felony in Missouri, punishable by up to 4 years in prison. Martha, considered a victim due to evidence of prolonged psychological coercion, did not face criminal charges, but her ability to care for the children was questioned in court. Elijah Shelton's trial began in February 1983 and attracted significant regional media attention, despite efforts to keep the case relatively discreet and protect the children's privacy. The Shannon County Court hosted one of the most complex and morally challenging cases in its history. During the trial, Elijah's defense, led by public defender Gerald Thompson, argued that extreme isolation and the dysfunctional environment in which he had been raised had compromised his ability to discern basic social and moral norms. Thompson presented evidence that Harold and Edith Shelton, Elijah and Martha's parents, had deliberately isolated their children, depriving them of formal education and normal social contact. The defendant, argued Thompson, is the product of generational isolation and possibly of previous endogamy. He himself is the son of first cousins who raised him believing the outside world was hostile and that the family should remain introspective. The prosecution, represented by Amanda Lewis, recognized the attenuating circumstances but maintained that Elijah understood the nature of his actions. The defendant demonstrated the ability to interact with the community when necessary, to conduct basic business, and to deliberately hide the true nature of his relationship with his sister, Lewis argued. These are not the actions of someone unable to distinguish right from wrong. Martha Shelton testified behind closed doors. Edited excerpts from her testimony, subsequently disclosed, revealed a pattern of psychological manipulation that began after her parents' death when she was 29 and Elijah was 33. According to Martha, Elijah gradually assumed full control over all aspects of her life, isolating her more and more and convincing her that the outside world represented a threat to their safety and family unit. He told us we were special, said Martha. That our blood was pure, that our children would be strong because they wouldn't be contaminated by the outside world. At first I resisted, but after years alone with him, I started to believe. Dr. Richard Foster, a psychiatrist specializing in social isolation and abusive family dynamics, testified as an expert, explaining to the jury the profound effects of extreme isolation and prolonged indoctrination. What we see here is a classic case of an alternative reality constructed through isolation. When a person is systematically excluded from all normative social references, their perception of what is acceptable can be radically distorted. The trial also highlighted the failure of local institutions to identify and intervene in the situation. Evidence revealed that concerns had been expressed by at least 3 different people over the years: Reverend Miller, the neighbor Sarah Jenkins, and an employee of the Current River Supply Store who noticed similarities between the children and the adults who occasionally visited. In no case was there proper follow-up by the authorities, revealing systemic failures in monitoring isolated communities and in protecting vulnerable people in remote rural areas. After 2 weeks of testimony, The jury found Elijah Shelton guilty of incest but recommended leniency due to attenuating circumstances. Judge Eleanor Simmons sentenced him to 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months and ordered compulsory psychological treatment. In her final statement, Judge Simmons noted, "This case represents a collective failure not just of the defendant, who is nevertheless responsible for his actions, but of a society that allows entire families to fall outside our protection and support systems. Geographical isolation should not mean institutional abandonment." As for the children, the court ordered them to remain temporarily in state custody while Martha received intensive psychological treatment. The ultimate goal was family reunification, provided Martha demonstrated the capacity to properly care for the children and integrate them into the broader community. The children were placed in a foster home in a neighboring county where they began to receive formal education and medical treatment for their various conditions. Thomas, the eldest, demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability, rapidly catching up to his peers educationally. Sudie, despite her initial delay, had more difficulty with social adaptation but responded well to treatment for her strabismus and other health problems. Jacob, the youngest and most severely affected by genetic disorders, underwent several surgeries to correct his malformations and started intensive care for his developmental delays. Comprehensive genetic tests revealed all 3 children were carriers of multiple genetic anomalies resulting from endogamy. Thomas presented mainly minor problems, such as polydactyly, which was surgically corrected, and a predisposition to certain autoimmune diseases. Sudie presented more significant problems, including a rare enzymatic deficiency that affected her metabolism and required continuous medication. Jacob, as previously identified, suffered from a Pert syndrome among other complications that would require lifelong medical care. The Shelton case triggered significant changes in service policies in Missouri and neighboring states. The Shelton Law, approved by the State Legislative Assembly in 1985, established more rigorous protocols for monitoring families in isolated areas, including regular visits by social workers and wellness checks for all children, regardless of formal complaints. Elijah Shelton served 22 months of his sentence before being released on parole in 1985. As a condition of his release, he was prohibited from returning to the family property while the children were in Martha's care and had to undergo continuous therapy and regular supervision. Martha, after 2 years of intensive care, regained custody of the children in 1984. With state assistance, she moved to a small house on the outskirts of West Plains where the children could continue their studies and medical treatment. She completed her own GED, a high school equivalent diploma, and eventually obtained a job as an assistant at a local library. The history of the Shelton family continued to evolve in the following decades. Thomas, the eldest son, overcame the adversities of his upbringing and graduated in social work, dedicating his career to helping vulnerable children. Sudie faced more difficulties, battling chronic health problems and psychological challenges related to her past, but ultimately found stability as an artist and artisan. Jacob, despite his physical and cognitive limitations, achieved a semi-independent life with community support and became an advocate for the rights of people with disabilities in rural areas. The Shelton case remains an iconic study in schools of social work and law across the country, illustrating the complex intersections between geographic isolation, rural poverty, dysfunctional family dynamics, and institutional failures. It also highlights the physical and psychological effects of endogamy, not just on the directly affected children but on subsequent generations as well. In 2002, 20 years after the initial discovery, Margaret Wilson, then retired, reflected on the case in an interview with a local newspaper. "What is most impressive looking back is how something so extreme could happen practically in sight of everyone. It wasn't a cabin in the middle of nowhere, it was less than 30 kilometers from a city, in a county with resources and institutions allegedly capable of protecting the vulnerable. It makes one wonder how many other similar cases exist, hidden in remote valleys or in plain sight, waiting for someone to pay attention." The original Shelton property, abandoned for years, was eventually sold by the state in 1990. The cabin collapsed over time, but the land remains a silent reminder of how extreme isolation can distort realities and perpetuate cycles of harm for generations. If you have watched this far, it is because you care about these cases that mark families forever. Leave a comment saying I watched here so we can know who truly cares about the search for truth. Don't forget to like this video and share it with those who also value understanding the complexities of human nature and the importance of effective protection systems. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now to follow more investigations into cases that make us reflect on our society and collective responsibility.